Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Cone Dodger here. Welcome back to BeamNG and the 2020 Dodge Viper build-off competition. We are going to look at the final scores of the 10 competitors that I chose out of the 80-plus entries that I thought best represented possible 2020 Dodge Viper concepts. There's a lot of other different entries, some of which I thought were more on the concept car side, and that it was its own, legitimate way to go. But I wanted a group of 10 cars, and this was the group that presented it to me. This is cars I think could take over and continue on the Viper legacy. The scoring that I made was all determined prior to the cars being built, and the scoring was made to make sure that the car retained Viperness and helped carry the car into the future. The categories were 10-year-old wow factor, Viper legacy, timelessness, drivetrain plausibility, drivetrain creativity, Darwin check, handling course fun, trackability, street presence, and the cars and coffee test. These are all very strange, different, hoops that these cars had to get through that were not determined beforehand. People did not build these cars with these categories in mind. These categories were just created to help narrow down the field and make sure that the end product was a car that was as Viper as possible and as good to move the car into the future as possible, and was a creative and interesting build. All of those things kind of got mixed into the considerations here. So, the cars are now in the order in which they finished the competition. Let's quickly go through them. With all the cars lined up on the road here, I'm going to give the street presence score as well as the overall score for all the cars, and just a quick overview. This street presence score was actually made at the very beginning when I had all the cars in the parking lot and was first getting them lined up before I knew who anybody's car was. I gave them the street presence score, and that may have played a very big factor in the end running, and I'm glad I did it that way because now I know these cars through and through, and I think I would have had a harder time scoring them in street presence, knowing, what they actually drove like. So, first up was Ericsson's car, which was kind of my European entry, whether you intended it to be that way or not. I had many cars like this, and ended up not being quite Viper enough, nor unique enough of a product, and the scores reflected that. The street presence, it also reflected its lack of uniqueness, and it only scored a 2. The total score ended up being a 34 out of 75. Next up we had SimCity's entry, and this one ended up being kind of my Asian-inspired entry, again, whether you intended that way or not, because it really reminded me of like a Lexus take on a Viper, and thanks to that, it has a kind of adolescent look. It looks a little boy racer in a group of cars that all look quite mature and muscular, which is something that I think the Viper has always had. So it did hurt that score on street presence. This was actually our 1-point street presence car. The drivetrain was very Viper, and there was some Viper takes on it, but overall just didn't quite give us enough Viper vibes and Viper looks. So this one ended up with a 39 out of 75. Next up we had Cool K, who had an elegant design. It was very beautiful and striking. This one ended up with an 8 in street presence, which really helped it score. I say that because this car, it looked very elegant, and it also drove very elegant, which hurt it in the Viper contest, because this car would make an amazing car. It would probably make an amazing, future Jaguar, or even an Aston Martin, or a BMW. It didn't make a great Viper. And thanks to that, it scored 43 out of 75. This is one of those examples of a car that was built and crafted very superbly, but maybe wasn't Viper enough. And then we have Hint Boy Right. This one scored 6 in street presence. Does have a lot of that great presence, especially from the front. I really loved the front end design of this car. It's extremely Viper and takes the design and makes it even sharper and more aggressive. I like the small nature of the car. There was a lot of good with this design. The problems with it tended to be more to the fact that it was a little too safe in the underpinnings. The look was very Viper. The driving wasn't very Viper. It just didn't. It didn't remind me. It didn't bring me back to the Viper, kind of legacy, even in its driving. And then it, at the end of the day, wasn't unique enough to be, a fresh, brand new take on a Viper. So that's where Hint Boy Wright's car ended up scoring 43 out of 75. Moving right along to Title Guy, who got 4 points in street presence. This one's another one of those elegant designs, a little bit European inspired, but very Viper underneath. Title Guy's car did very well at being a Viper, but it almost did too well at being a Viper, where it would try to kill you anytime you tried to drive it. This one kind of ended up averaging out. The elegant design made it timeless, the Viperness of the drivetrain kept its legacy, but all together as a package, it didn't quite work together, it didn't all gel together, and the points ended up showing it at 45 out of 75. Really lost points in the ability to have fun with the car. It was kind of a safe option for drivetrain stuff at a 9 on drivetrain plausibility, but with that, the two didn't work together. To be so very Viper underneath and then to not really look very Viper, that didn't quite work together for me there, and that's where it's got its score of 45 out of 75. On the other hand, we have Cameron's entry, who, let's see, this one scored 3 on street presence, mostly due to the fact that its street presence loses out thanks to looking like the last gen Viper. That's not a huge knock against the design. I mean, the Viper street presence is the whole point of this category, right? However, I had to take into consideration the fact that it's not a unique enough design, and if it was put next to the last gen Viper, I don't think it would stand out versus that one even. So that's where it kind of lost some points there. But this one was an interesting one because the design, the chassis, the engine, everything about this car was Viper, except it was all last gen Viper. So it didn't take us to the future, but still scored 47 out of 75. Durbuyer's entry, a very elegant design. This one is one of the ones that grew on me a lot. Let me see, what did I initially score it as a street presence? I did give it a 7, so it does have a lot of presence. I just wasn't sure how Viper it was, and the Viper Legacy score hurt there, and the underpinnings were very traditional, but it ended up driving very Viper-like. It ended up being a lot of fun. I don't think it was, again, a unique enough take. For it being as kind of not Viper looking overall, it did have some elements of Viper, but not quite enough. It also wasn't a unique take on the Viper. So if this design had maybe tried something, totally new and strange drivetrain-wise, maybe it could have totally been a package for me. But to be very Viper in a not very Viper wrapper kind of hurt it there. But it was still a very striking and interesting design and a fun car to drive. Durbuyer gets 50 out of 75. Next up is Dietrich's entry. This is one of our podium cars, 3rd place. Dietrich's entry. This one was the winner of the street presence. This car oozes street presence. It's one of the designs that I think most grabs you from any angle. It's the most flamboyant designed while still looking sleek. It was very, very tough to try to take marks away on this car for anything. What it lost points in was Viper Legacy, because it's so great and so sleek and so, it had a lot of wow factor. It just didn't have any Viper to it. Like, if there was no contest here and this car was just sent to me, I would have no idea that this was going to be a Viper, replacement. And that's kind of what hurt it there. Other than that, it did very, very well. It was very fun to drive. I think it was one of the most fun to drives. It just didn't act very Viper either. So it looked not very Viper, and it didn't drive very Viper. It looked amazing, and it drove amazing. So that's kind of where, and actually makes me feel good about my scoring system, this car falls. It's just a fantastically built car that happens to not be the most Viper. So that one ends up scoring 52 out of 75. Next up is an interesting one. Chipskate's entry came out of nowhere. I really did not expect it out of this car. It scored a 5 on street presence, and I think some of that, even in the initial, like, just grouping up in the parking lot, I noticed how tiny it was. You know, it just didn't have that huge persona like a Viper had. But it made up for it with a really well-designed body. I think this is some of the best use of fixtures in all of the competition. This looks like a production-ready car. It's very sleek and yet aggressive. I really liked the design of this car. And then when you drove it, it also drove very nice. It's a different take on a Viper. Obviously, this was our 5-cylinder entry, and there's some questions there. Oh, could a Viper have a 5-cylinder? I kind of thought the same thing, and then when I drove it, it proved me that it could. This one scored 58 out of 75. Honestly, street presence is where this car lost the competition, and that's just kind of how it went. You know, it happened to be an amazing car, a very different take. You took a huge challenge, I think, in trying to pull off this design, and second place is a huge mark for a 5-cylinder Viper representation, a 5-cylinder small car representation. You did something really amazing with this design, and it was one of the most surprising to me. And the winner! Honestly, when I drove this car, and I think it was one of the first ones I drove, I didn't think this car was going to be the winner. Because it didn't really stand out to me. And that might be surprising to you, considering it's sitting here at the top step. Its street presence was strong from the gate. This car looks like a race car. It reminds me of an ACR. It has that look to it that would impress both kids and adults, I think. The way the car drove was very strong. It had a very plausible engine. It had tons of Viper legacy in it, tons of Viper touches in it, and then a design that was ultimately, I think, works for it. I would have given it higher marks in timelessness if it wasn't so kind of overdone. It does look a little, like I said, it's an ACR. It's not a regular Viper. This is not what I would think a stock, street car presentation would be. So it could have done better there. But then it handled good and had Viper tendencies in, that it wanted to kill you. Was a good total package. So yeah, it wasn't one that stood out in any particular way. It just did good enough in everything. It's a modern take. It's modern looks. It's very Viper in looks and very Viper in driving, and yet still seems like a car that was gone through and ended up driving very good. It scored 61 out of 75. So Zeppy's car is the winner of the Viper 2020 contest. This is the car, I think, out of the group, thanks to the scoring system, is the most likely to be a Viper replacement in the future. Honestly, though, I'm going to say any of the top 3 are very much so there. Any of the top 3 were very plausible Viper replacements, and honestly, a huge amount of this 10-car field ended up being that way. Most importantly, this was a lot of fun. I really loved driving everybody's cars. I liked seeing everybody's takes and comparing it to my own. It was a huge undertaking, and I'm glad people did enjoy it. I'm glad people enjoyed the competition. Maybe a little bit more than they actually enjoyed the way that the judging and such went, but that's the nature of the beast. I had a lot of fun with it and learned a lot for future competitions. And before we go here, I suppose it needs to be said how my car did in the competition, which is interesting. It actually did pretty well. It would have scored just ahead of Dietrich's entry. It would have been the number 3 car with a 55 out of 75, which I'm happy with because it means that I made the scoring in a way that didn't just favor my personal desires in a Viper, because my personal desires in a Viper doesn't necessarily mean that that's the option that is the best moving forward. It doesn't mean it's the best build car. I am not the best car builder. That is for darn sure. I took a lot of penalties on myself to pull off a certain look, and yeah, the scores reflect that. At the end of the day, the only thing I'm surprised, next time pick some more unique colors, people. Alright, that is it for the scoring. Let's go take Zeppy's car out for a ride and end out this video. It's been a little while since I drove Zeppy's car, so I'm going to re-familiarize myself with it just a little bit here. Oh yeah, it's very Viper, isn't it? I do remember now. It does something that I really want out of the next generation Viper, and that is keep the V10, but make it into a V10 that people actually like, because I don't know that a lot of the journalists or even just car fans in general have always really liked the Viper V10. It always seemed a little immature and not refined. So to take that engine and to make it into something that, you know, the world would take note of would be very nice. But this car does retain a lot of Viperness to it, which is good. It's still scary, it still has the big presence and look, and yeah, I think that's why this car ended up where it is. There was so many entries to this contest. I honestly was not prepared for it. This whole thing, I think, really is a practice exercise for me to see how I could do things like this in the future. It is kind of an interesting one that I picked to be the first contest because it's something that I'm so interested in. Like, I have a large, you know, personal affinity for the Viper, so it's something that I am exorbitantly, you know, passionate about more than the average person should be. And I chose that because I knew this was going to be a challenge for me to figure out how this whole contest system works and how the build-offs would work with automation and BeamNG working together. It was much more difficult. I've done contests in automation in the past, and those were far easier, both in choosing like the winners and whatnot, and just in like the logistics of it all. So in the future, I'm going to have to do things a little bit differently, but I do think everyone who joined and took part in the competition joined to watch in the entries, and even if you didn't compete, thank you for taking part in the experiment. There's still a lot of cars that I would like to showcase in different ways that were part of our entries, and I will find some way to do that, but I need a little bit of a break right now. But don't worry, if you submitted a car and you're a little bummed out that it didn't get shown, it didn't get an award, and it didn't get into the 10 finalists, either on Twitch or in video on YouTube, I plan to use a lot more of these cars. But that will do it for our 2020 Viper finalist video. Congratulations to Zeppy, very good job, and congratulations to everybody that entered, that made it into this final 10. There was 80 plus other cars just to get down to that point, so even if you didn't score well in this, you did a good job of standing out amongst the crowd, which is a huge part of a competition like this. Alright everybody, thanks for watching, thanks for your support, and I will see you next time. Nah, I won't leave you hanging like that. Everyone wants to see the jump.